panel, women live in many different countries, and that is important because if these people were to live in developed countries, they would be the most disadvantaged within that country. Therefore, it's exclusively arbitrary for this team to say that just because they live in different countries, that feminists ought not care about them. They ought not prioritise the most needy and the most disadvantaged to the exclusion of those who have comparative benefits. The first thing I'm going to do in this speech is provide 2 points of context. The first point of context is that the types of issues predominantly facing feminists in domestically or developed countries are typically normative issues. For example, norms around sexuality or gender identity, but in international contexts, they're much more concrete and tangible issues which affect people to a much greater degree, both in the short term, so for example, access to contraception or abortion. For example, you may live in a regional area of India where abortion may not be illegal, but it's incredibly hard for you to access. Or long-term issues in terms of concrete issues, for example, legislative protections which work against you, and the empowerment of women more broadly, in both in the familial and social sense, and in the business context. So importantly, there are issues in international arenas which are more concrete and tangible, and have a much stronger causal impact to the lives of people, and the impact that they have is much more tangible. Therefore, we ought to highlight those and prioritise those. Secondly, these are issues which need an injection of capital now. So there is a time sensitivity here, and that's to say that feminist organisations or networks in developing countries often either don't exist, or if they do exist, are incredibly nascent in their formation. That's important because government grants are not given to these organisations. That means that they need external support to fight pressing issues now. That's why the biggest marginal impact that feminists in developed countries can create is by helping women in developing countries as a priority. So, next question in this speech. I'm going to make it clear what this actually looks like and what we are proposing and supporting for the side affirmative. Firstly, 2 prongs here. Firstly, in terms of discourse and advocacy, we think that this looks like devoting the times that you could have when you are using a platform from a position of power as a feminist in a developed country to the benefit of feminists in developing countries. So, for example, Oprah or Roxane Gay, we would have them prioritise issues of women in developing countries as opposed to those in developed countries, and focusing on those international issues. Secondly, academic writing, such as from Catherine McKinnon or Anne Summers, would focus on international and developing country issues as opposed to developed country issues. Thirdly, blogs in feminist organisations such as legal centres or feminist CLCs would write about issues facing women in developing countries and would focus their attention on that. Fourthly, broader awareness campaigns might exist. So, for example, social media could be used as a force for good. For example, in the way in which Michelle Obama responded to Boko Haram kidnapping women overseas in a developing country by basically creating a hashtag which ultimately may not have been completely effective, but was still marginally better effective than doing nothing, and highlighting that as an outcome as well. Fifthly, we'd also support this in terms of university groups and feminist collectives. So that's discourse and advocacy. What we would also support is the provision and acquisition of funding and finances, both in terms of capital and profit, but also in terms of human capital. So we would encourage women from developed countries to go to developing countries and provide assistance on the ground. That mechanism for this may be donation drives, it may be hosting ticketed events, it may be providing funds from established organisations in the West developed countries and diverting those funds to developing countries. So bodies such as Sappho in India, which is an emerging queer women's collective and network, could get funding from organisations which already exist under the status quo in developed countries. The question that is important in this debate, and I think is the most important piece of framing, is where can feminists make the biggest difference, and why is there a principled reason to not care about women in developing countries and only care about women in developed countries? But we think it's the opposite, and now I'll tell you why there's a principled imperative to act under the status quo. Firstly, under principle, 4 reasons. Firstly, this is consistent with the aims of the feminist movement. That's a movement which, by most accounts in recent times, is showing a revealed preference in terms of caring about intersectionality and inclusivity, even where that is particularly harmful or practically harmful to white women and white feminists in developed countries. Second, the axes of oppression that harm women in developing countries are often one which benefit women in developed countries. So systems of economic trade, systems of neoliberal economics, harm women in developing countries to the benefit ultimately of women in developed countries. Thirdly, there's a comparative lack in terms of the lottery of birth from women in developed countries which they benefit from and developing countries do not. And fourthly, we think it's broadly the responsibility of activists to act in such a way to give a voice to others, particularly where that voice is a voice which they would not otherwise have, and that this would be the only option for them to get people to hear about their issues and to confront the reality in which they live on a day-to-day basis. So why is there an imperative to do this? 5 reasons. Firstly, because there are certain issues in certain countries which people are simply not cognizant of, and that is people in developed countries as well as people themselves in developing countries. Secondly, because in these countries the feminist movements are emerging and nascent. As I've already said, there is very limited support from them, from government or business organisations, so they're in a position of no alternatives, and we provide one. Thirdly, we think that women in developing countries have more infringements of their rights, that abortions are blocked or are difficult to access in India, that sex-selective abortions occur in developing countries, that STD protection is particularly poor, that property rights are not ones which are enjoyed by women in developing countries, that they lack autonomy in the way in which Saudi Arabia has apps for men and to track their wives and the way in which they go about their day. That looks like de jure as in legal and de facto as in real subjugation and oppression and the infringement of rights, and these are time-sensitive issues. Many of these are difficult, but not all of them are. Some just require attention and a bit of funding to kickstart a big change. Fourthly, in these countries, they traditionally have stronger systems of patriarchy and patronage, which have not been brought down in the way in which that has been somewhat diminished in developed countries. And fifthly, there are less economic opportunities for women in developing countries to actualise their identity and to gain full autonomy. So, with that said, I'm now going to talk about efficacy and why this will be effective. And finally, I'm going to talk about developed countries, which we will expand on in their speech. Firstly, in terms of efficacy, 5 points here. Firstly, infrastructure is tangible and simple to create and does not necessarily require legislative change. So this may mean that just creating an abortion clinic in a particular area has a huge benefit, and the West is in excess of capital, both in terms of funds and in terms of human capital, and that's what we redivert to areas which need it most. Secondly, many women just do not know of feminist movements or its motivations in developing countries. And those that do typically fall victim to narratives that feminism is a Western concept tailored for Western interests and particularly the interests of Western women. That's something which we push back against, and we say that this is not something which they only care about, they do care about women in developing countries as well. Thirdly, in terms of foreign aid, it's easy to justify to domestic governments so you can lobby for grants and aid to that government to provide support for women in developing countries. Fourthly, by building up feminist organisations, you show to men in those countries that feminism is not a zero-sum concept. You tackle the issue of male fragility and say that what benefits women is not necessarily something which will harm men and will harm the systems that you dominate on. Finally, even if we cannot get widespread change, compare that with the difficulty of changing certain norms in the West. So even if this is not easy, and we never pretended it would be, it is comparatively easier, and if it is not, it is still a goal worth pursuing. Finally, I'm going to talk about developed countries in this speech. We think that broadly, developed countries have already created self-sustaining feminist movements. They don't need Oprah to push their cause as much as women in developing countries need people like Oprah or other international icons to prove their causes. 4 reasons for this. Firstly, let's be very clear, we are not devoting exclusive attention or only attention to developing country issues, but we would prioritise it. So, feminist lawyers in the West can still tackle issues of consent. Social workers can still advocate for domestic violence centres. The difference is that we prioritise the bulk of capital, but not all the capital. Secondly, politicians still have a political incentive to care about women's issues in the West because they are fully fledged democracies in a way in which developing countries aren't. Thirdly, charity is something which is persuasive to appeal to moderates. That allows you to get more funding from people in the West to divert to both feminist issues in developing countries, but also developed countries. Finally, you attack narratives of hypocrisy that exist in the West, that right-wing people levy against feminists, that they only care about themselves, that they don't care about other people, and that they do not care about people in developing countries. We care about developing countries, their issues are important, their issues are real, that's why we're proud to propose.
Speaker panel, you know what pisses me off the most about women's forums at debating tournaments? When random white women who are in the top 10 world speaker list decide to have a 5-minute rant about why women of colour in debating are oppressed and we can help them by doing X, Y, Z. Yes, it's true, people in the room probably listen to that white woman more than they would ever listen to me, but no, it is not true that they can advocate for this more effectively when I experience and understand the way to fix that issue much better, and when I am someone who probably should never advocate for like Asian women being oppressed of sweatshops. That's the fundamental core of this debate and something the affirmative team has literally no conception of. I'm going to do a lot of things in this speech today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about what does this actually look like, because I think Stu's own characterization actually really helps us. Because when he says like, oh, we'll just have like Oprah have like interviews about women in like developing world, and we'll have more of these famous people talking about the issues, like literally, what do you think that will change? Because let's be clear here, in the status quo, it's not true that no one talks about things in the developing world. We do talk about it, and in fact, your very own examples like Michelle Obama tweeting about Barack about Nigeria is like exactly what we would still support. We would still support feminists in the developed world talking about these issues. We wouldn't want them to allocate the majority of funding to these issues. We would rather Michelle Obama write a book about her experiences as a black woman in America, which was a million, best book seller, rather than her write an entire book about Nigeria, which probably would have sold nothing. That's what's really important. The second thing to say though is under what this looks like, we think it's very likely the kinds of feminists who are likely to be at the forefront of these movements are the kind of white feminists who are already at the forefront of movements like the gender pay gap, right? For example, we think it's unlikely a Muslim woman is going to be the one who dictates the mainstream feminist movement. It's more likely to be people like Hillary Clinton or Sheryl Sandberg who are at the forefront. It's very important to note that caveat because those people are the ones who are least likely to understand the kinds of repression that women in developing countries are facing, and that's what's important. First issue, why principally do we not have the weird obligation that Stu says we have? So, Stu tells us that in feminist movements, there's a principled obligation to prioritize the most needy. If that were the case, can you guys please tell us why you would defend white people only ever caring about issues to do with non-white people? Because I think your analysis would suggest that in the developed world, white feminists should only ever advocate for women of colour if this topic wasn't in place. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay. Actually, better example. I just thought of a better one. So it's saying not only should you advocate for developing women, you should only advocate for developing women who are the most poor. So if you get what I'm saying. So the other thing I'm going to say is our rebuttal in substantive is why principally that shouldn't be the case. We tell you principally, if you are in a movement, you have a principled right to prioritize yourself. Why is that the case? That's the case because we think in a movement, often one where you are being oppressed, you have an obligation to try and help those around you and yourself from being less oppressed. We think that's a perfectly justifiable principle, right? Because men don't have this extra principle placed upon them where they have to go and help other less privileged men, right? The same reason that it's unfair for us to impose an extra burden just because you already happen to be a minority. But the second thing is, we think as a movement, you owe a principled obligation more to the people within your movement than those outside the movement. Why is that the case? Because a domestic feminist movement contains the funding and the people power from the people within that movement in the country. Therefore, your movement should try and produce the most amount of outcomes for the people who are actively contributing to that movement. Okay, secondly, why we actually think even if principally there was an obligation owed, there is more harm to this model happening, that we would still be justified in not pursuing it. There are a number of harms that come along with this movement. The first thing to say is all the people who are advocating for the kinds of policy changes that Stu wants to talk about have literally no lived experiences of those policies, right? For example, if you want to say Sharia law is oppressive to women, you think people shouldn't have to wear the burqa, you think that they should be allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, those are all issues these women have no first-hand experience talking about. Why is that a bad thing? That's a bad thing because they get to alleviate their moral guilt of being the beneficiaries of these oppression because they are perceived as fighting against this oppression, when in fact they are the literal oppressors who are contributing to that, right? By Stuart's own analysis, he says developed world women benefit from the labour that happens in the developing country. So if you think that's true, then are you saying all women should not work? Yeah, because then they wouldn't contribute to the oppression. So do you see how there's a hypocrisy morally because you're advocating for issues which you are systemically part of? But the second thing to say is a lot of ideals in the Western world are fundamentally different to the developing world, right? For example, in the developed world, women think that modesty should be something feminists care about. They should be allowed to wear whatever they want. Whereas a lot of Muslim women do believe in the burqa because they think of it as a religious and cultural symbol to their own identity. We think what's likely to happen is feminists who dictate this movement are likely to lobby against things like the burqa, and that takes away agency from the women themselves in the developing countries. Second thing to talk about. Oh, I need to take a break, so I'll talk a bit slower from now on. Second thing to talk about. We think a lot of the rhetoric that's likely to build around this kind of movement is going to be racially fueled, right? To the extent that a lot of these developed women will have to advocate in countries like Australia or the US, in order for them to sell their message, they have to rely on tropes about the developing world. That can be things like saying Sharia law is inherently sexist. That can be things like saying there are countries with value systems which are incompatible with women's rights. We think that's really harmful for a number of reasons. The first thing to say is it marginalizes the women of color who still live in the countries that the Western world is a part of. We think that means women who choose to still wear the burqa are alienated on the streets when the entire movement is trying to liberate Muslim women from having to wear that burqa. But the second thing to say is it's perceived as a hawkish intervention whereby Western imperialism imperialism, feminist ideals are enforced on women who do not share those same ideals. Secondly, though, and this is a really big harm, is it allows men to discredit the experiences of women in the developed country. Where, for example, like a random Scots boy can say like, oh, I don't understand why you're complaining about the pay gap when there are women who literally do not get paid. That means women who are in the developed world now have no platform to voice their own concerns, right? Because everyone in this feminist movement is now focusing and prioritizing on these issues, it means, number one, by comparing your experiences to that of the developing country, you seem obviously inherently privileged, and that's exactly what conservative media will use. But the second thing to say, even if you guys say there will still be people who advocate for these issues, the fact that there's less time, less capital, and less resources dedicated means that there's less overall airtime to explain the kind of issues, right? Like, I get paid an hour to explain to my Cranbrook boys why the pay gap exists, and they still don't understand. Imagine if I only got 5 minutes to explain to them. Like, you can see the harm there. The second thing to say, though, is Stu says, no, but this is good because now hypocrisy will be solved. But the really important thing to say is men will think of women as hypocritical because they are not prioritizing like the issues of driving, instead focusing on themselves when they still do choose to advocate for issues in the developed world. Lastly, why do we actually think this is not helpful at all and will in fact reduce the buy-in into feminism? First thing to say here is a lot of the policies that you want to change in the developing world are really far removed. That means things like either one, trying to change the social, cultural and historical attitudes within that country, or number two, trying to change governing policy, and that can be things like Sharia law or things inherent to that society. The second thing to say is a lot of the attitudes you want to change, people in the developed world have already agreed upon. For example, there is no point in you being in America telling people that FGM is bad, because they already agree FGM is bad. It's not about the impact you have is going towards the wrong place, because the actual impact you need is the government to change the idea, and that doesn't happen by you prioritizing this. The last thing to say though is what it does do is it makes feminism as a movement much less relatable to people. The reason that's true is because when Michelle Obama writes an entire book about Nigeria that no one reads, there's an opportunity cost because she doesn't write Becoming anymore, and I don't cry anymore at the end of the book. But the second thing to say is it also sacrifices literal capital, which is exactly what Stu wanted when he said he wanted money to be allocated to these movements instead. I have a lot more things to say, so Connor's probably going to say them. Really proud to negate.
You know what I hate at women's forums at debating tournaments is when girls from Abbottsley and Skeggs and boys from Cranbrook and Grammar talk about, Spix differential in finals, rather than the fact that overwhelmingly universities send almost no people of colour to tournaments like Easters, and we should probably focus more on those things. So when Liliana says that maybe it's bad to focus, paternalistically on these issues, the alternative was not focusing on them, and focusing on the things domestically were far less relevant and already going to be cared about for the issues that we give you in Stuart's speech, that women in the West and women like in this room will still talk with their friends about these issues. Their government grants will still exist because people are already aware of feminism. But donating to feminist organisations overseas, helping start them up, not just like posting on Twitter like Liliana Strawman, wasn't happening right now. And we thought we could make the biggest marginal difference by focusing our efforts where we could concretely make change rather than trying to abstractly change norms. 4 questions in this speech. Firstly, what does this look like and the horrendous straw man that comes from Liliana's speech? Secondly, is it going to be effective or will it be done paternalistically? Thirdly, what happens to domestic issues? And lastly, a piece of substantive about engagement in the feminist movement. Firstly, what does this look like? The first thing they said was it was just talk. Convenient to ignore the first minute and a half of Stuart's speech. What were we willing to do? Firstly, fund feminist organisations overseas. And the example we gave you was like Sappho, like I visited in Mumbai, which is an organisation that literally houses lesbian women who have been forced out of their family. And that isn't paternalistic, and maybe it's a form of paternalism that we would support. But secondly, we'd encourage funding not to Kickstarter campaigns for biodegradable tampons like Lena Dunham supports, but maybe focusing our efforts on donating to international causes, which are far more important than the things that will already be cared about in the West. Or thirdly, it would devote attention to women travelling overseas through exchange programs by saying, here are the feminist organisations that you should go and support, rather than just talking in wokos domestically about issues just on campus, which will be talked about anyway. Or fourthly, it's charities and fundraising like community legal centres diverting their efforts to help legal organisations overseas to help create legislative change. Or 5, it's redirecting government grants that feminist organisations currently get to send overseas that are headed by women in those countries. And they didn't respond to any of those but the worst case characterisation. Secondly, Liliana said it will be controlled by white people and they will say the burqa is bad. Do you know why women and white women think the burqa is bad? Because they have no engagement with these issues in the first instance. Perhaps when we force them to interrogate those biases, to fund those organisations overseas, to encourage them to travel there and connect with a feminist organisation internationally, perhaps they would learn. On their side, the reason why they don't believe that the burqa is a good thing is because they have little exposure to women from that community. And maybe when a feminist organisation changes tack and says there are more important issues in the world to care about and involves more Muslim women in their collectives because that is a priority, or more migrant women in their collectives at the expense of white women, that changes. Again, I'm comparative from this negative team. Thirdly, but also, as the affirmative team, I reckon we could just divert funding to the organisations that don't say ban the burqa. Like, I think that's well within our fiat. Thirdly, on the principle, the first thing I said is the logical extension is you should give all your money away to everything. Obviously not. The priority is to maximally affect change, and the thing that we said is you can make the biggest marginal difference by funding the organisations overseas that have no alternatives. There are many, many organisations that will care about domestic issues. Feminist lawyers will campaign to change consent laws in Australia. Feminist people in your community will talk about rape and sexual assault. But the problem is, feminist organisations in rural India do not exist, and that is where we can make the biggest difference. Secondly, Liliana said, well, men don't have an obligation to help the less privileged men. Well, logically, extension, should men have an obligation to be feminists? Probably. Like, it's a good, and the debate is a should debate. Like, should we do this? It's not like, does everyone have the utmost moral obligation to? If we prove good outcomes, we win the debate. So the principle is stupid, and I don't think actually matters. Secondly, on is this going to be effective? Literally, the only harm coming from the negative team is that this will be racist. And note, where was the analysis about how it wasn't going to be racist on their side, or how women in the West would just not totally ignore the issues of the developing world? What do we say? Firstly, in the status quo, the reason that narratives are racist around the burqa is because when limited airtime is devoted to talking about the complexities of living as a Muslim woman, it is far easier to send a narrative that the burqa is bad and Islam is bad to women, rather than stepping through the nuances of how women can live under Sharia law perfectly fine. And that happens on their side when you don't devote more attention, when you don't prioritise Muslim women's voices. But secondly, there's no interaction or less interaction on their side. Like, you should have Michelle Obama and Oprah Winfrey, you know, like choosing the worst examples from our side, to go and talk to Muslim women and prioritise their time rather than doing what they currently do. But thirdly, we get more women of colour involved in the movement and second generation migrants that I'll talk about later, which is another reason why our feminist movement is better. The second argument they said is that it will be paternalistic and you won't be able to like literally implement the things. Firstly, it doesn't need government consent. Like, you can bank transfer or give cash to like feminist organisations in India. An abortion is legal. The problem is that there aren't many centres everywhere. The government won't oppose it that you're trying to help those organisations, and given that they will be building them, not like white ribbon, but the organisation locally will be funded and building them, there won't be opposition. But secondly, many of the things help men too. It is important that there are abortion clinics which often have surgical centres, which means that men can have access to healthcare in rural areas. They won't be always opposed by the local people there. But lastly, we can also try and get legislative change in the way of funding organisations to raise awareness to feminism. And lastly, the alternative is far, far worse. Like, the biggest harm was just like, we're going to tell everyone to ban the burqa and, you know, like hate on Muslim women everywhere. At no point did they prove why that was better on their side. Lastly, what did we say on effectiveness? We said three very clear things in why it would be effective. Firstly, you're far more likely to get more money into the movement that can be distributed not only locally, but internationally, for the reasons that women feel like feminism is not just a Western concept, that people feel like their issues are being cared about, that they see the issue as more relevant, and governments are more likely to fund you when you say you're actually doing concrete things rather than like changing norms or holding a protest march. Secondly, infrastructure is crucial and very easy to build, but you don't have the money right now in the developing country. But thirdly, we can grow local feminist organisations in an incredibly important way. And lastly, substantively, there are flow-on effects to the things you do in developing countries back to other countries, in that having research to investigate why HPV is transmitted in certain circumstances has impacts everywhere. The problem is the normative issues in developed countries are different in each culture. Like, France had an incredibly negative reaction to Me Too because it was against the principles on which the French Republic was built, and campaigning in those things doesn't have cross-pollination, but the ones in developing countries does. Third issue, domestic issues. They said it justifies men by saying, oh, you're focusing on the wrong things. No, because your response to the Scots boy, Liliana, would be like, no, I actually do donate to international causes, and the pay gap in Australia matters. Contrast, on their side, where it's just, yes, I've gone to the Women's March, so I'm a feminist. Like, you actually can prove you're making concrete change and do care about women everywhere and recognise that different issues can also be important. Again, I'm comparative. The last issue, and that I'm going to bring in also, we can still fund domestic causes, right? And they will still be funded because feminist lawyers still have a stake in their local community. That governments need to win elections on the basis of women's votes, so we'll still care about those issues domestically. The thing is, people don't care internationally when you don't prioritise those causes. Lastly, engagement with the feminist movement. Overseas women feel abandoned by it because one, it's perceived as a Western institution, and two, there's no contact with their presence. These guys are saying, oh, it's perceived as Western when you intervene. No, it'll break away that stereotype when you say, we care about your country. We are injecting money into your economy. We are building infrastructure in your area. Contrast on their side, where there is a Western institution, because there are no migrant women involved in that movement. And secondly, that leads to far more women of colour and migrant women and generationally separated women in the West involving in feminism, because they're not sexist, they just feel like the issue, the movement doesn't care about them in the debate. The big problem of this negative team is the stunning lack of comparativeness and the way in which they strawman our case. We should obviously care about these issues more. Domestic issues will still be cared about, but know what? These people have no alternatives and are clearly a priority.
The feminist movement is not a monolithic sovereign state with its own budget by which you can allocate to any social justice cause it wishes. It is, as First Affirmative concedes from the very beginning, a movement which is shaped by its own internal perceptions of normative issues being particularly important, firstly, and their lived experience of what feminist issues matter. That is unbelievably important in this debate, because Side Affirmative tries to assume that you can fiat the fact that these movements will donate to the best causes, the most important causes. What they miss is that there are extraordinarily powerful feminist movements that exist in developing countries. The Indian feminist movement has pushed back significantly against patriarchy within their country with normative assumptions that are different to Western feminists, that it is okay to wear the hijab, but we ought to focus on different interests. That's so critical, because what it means is both discursively and pragmatically, this policy will actively go against the interests of developing world feminists in the arenas by which they fight. But if, for example, these are nascent movements that are obviously not powerful, I do not understand why Saudi Arabia would allow for the funding of 5 developing world education centres for women. At best, their policy is flippant and enforceable. At worst, it actively undermines and corrodes the legitimacy of movements that have spent generations upon generations of arguing that no, we're not actually a Western proxy. We are fighting for our rights internally for what Indian feminism actually ought to look like. Firstly, what does this policy actually look like in action? They say 2 things. Firstly, there's a discourse, for example, blogs, writing, and you have donation drives. The idea is essentially a form of crude socialism, that you redistribute one part of the pie to a different part of the pie, and therefore we have more social justice. The problem with that is there is obviously no feminist budget. It heavily relies upon activating individual female feminists to donate to these particular causes. There are 3 structural reasons why this pie will be smaller under Affirmative, beating their own case. Firstly, structurally, you are biased towards your own experience. You care about your experience of sexual harassment, your experience of rape, your experience of body image, and experience of sexism in the developing world. That is why, when someone tells me about oppression and disadvantage and discrimination in Africa, people still don't vote for policies that benefit Africans, and you still don't donate to those drives because you are viscerally impacted by experiences surrounding you, and you are detached from the consequences of discrimination in different countries. Secondly, you obviously already believe normative narratives surrounding the idea that the burqa is bad, that the hijab is bad, that it is bad, for example, to support a lot of the policies that feminists in these movements would actively support and you have to fund. But thirdly, and importantly, there is literally no accountability. You cannot go to these countries, as they say, and look at the interventions. They're incredibly difficult to measure. It's incredibly difficult to measure how they change in comparison to all the other foreign policy instruments that work. So even if you have the perfect advocacy and you guys just shift a bit of the pie, you massively shrink the overall buy-in of domestic feminists. Women don't want to donate large portions of their income for foreign feminists they don't understand or care about. They want to be able to fight and drive get-up campaigns to get reforms for themselves, because those are the movements they care about, can actually analyse and can engage with. Side Affirmative devastatingly never explains how that could actually occur. Their one push of potential preemption is that there are more women of colour in this movement. 2 responses. 1, no. Obviously, they're still considering their own impacts and their own considerations within their country. But 2, this would massively decrease discrimination against women of colour in the West. The reason why is that it embodies these individuals to critique foreign countries and their forms of Islam. For example, that Iran and Saudi Arabia are oppressive. Underneath that, there will be, yes, they're not of education, but also they restrict abortion rights, they restrict the burqa, etc. Many expat individuals living in Australia, for example, may still hold these beliefs in their own communities. So you're likely to critique and oppress and discriminate against individual feminists or individual women in the developing world who are people of colour, and moreover, you're likely to generalise about that in the first place. Because if you are a white woman who does not have significant experience about what actually occurs in these individuals, you're likely to stereotype them as all being that way. Even if that money is delivered, obviously this debate occurs in that particular investment they're talking about. It just will not go to the worst country, the countries that are most oppressive. Because Saudi Arabia will just not accept that money. They will shut it down, and they will actively have retributive justice and violence against individuals that do in fact cause a simulation. But where this debate therefore matters, Speaker, is firstly in making Saudi Arabia crack down on any women's rights activism, because it is seen as Western interventionism, because that is the most powerful narrative that exists in countries that are post-colonial, Speaker. The number one accusation they levy is this is Western interventionism, which is completely legitimated by intervening by the West. Like, definitionally, that is what you are doing. But the final thing they say is there are foreign aid budgets. Obviously, first of all, they will not, like, foreign aid budgets are small because people are self-centered, which is the key thing of my speech. But secondly, their foreign aid budgets are controlled by conservative men who are likely to funnel that aid towards particular causes that are most in line with their ban the hijab style narration. That is the likely investments you get under their side of the house. Second issue of how this affects developing world feminism. We told you that in the developing world, it is seen as Western interventionism under the status quo, except where individuals have been able to distance themselves from that narrative by saying, we will support the hijab, for example, we just want education and investment in that. So that at that point, why is it still bad, even if it works? Even if it works under that point isn't true. First of all, it's a moral hazard point on two levels. One, it's a moral hazard for individual Western women, if their model is true, because they will overestimate the impact of their actions. They'll be like, well, I'm donating to a super important cause, so my $5 is so great and I'm doing so much. Whereas you're way more accountable for the actions you may take in Western countries, so you're far more likely to discharge that obligation earlier under their side of the house and do far less in that situation. But secondly, in countries like India, the governments are likely to abdicate their own responsibility in that sense, because they're likely to be like, well, these developing countries are funding this anyway, it's all fine. Finally, on developing world feminism. So basically their claim is you fix the problems that are most difficult. Our claim is you fix the problems with the most marginal impact. Stu says there's a sustained system under the status quo of feminism in the West. Firstly, untrue. Like, we do not have a number of reforms we require. Western feminism being essential in getting them, but it is not the, do not control the keys of power. But secondly, it obviously necessarily takes away that efficacy. Like, you cannot have Oprah talking as much about these issues to necessarily detract from that. And then say it undercuts the idea of hypocritical. Obviously, this is the feminist movement explaining why foreign rights are more important than domestic rights. So definitionally, it empowers conservative critiques of feminists that actually your matters issues don't matter as much as foreign issues. That's important because I've explained to you why domestic governments are self-interested in their own constituencies, as conceived. So therefore, they're likely to defund feminists because they're justifying why domestic interventions and funding doesn't matter by explaining why foreign funding matters. So you actually devastate their own efficacy. That's so important because getting women in power is actually the way you get all the benefits in developing world countries. You can't have the Australian government going in and bombing Syria to help women. You need individual leaders in parties or in particular businesses deciding to abandon sweatshop techniques and deciding to make reforms that actually benefit women overseas. You never get that because the argument as to why it's beneficial is far too nuanced for the average reasonable person. Whereas when you promote the idea that women should be elected domestically, that women should become powerful business, they accidentally also help women in the developing world. So that is our impact. Their final issue is the principle. Firstly, they say, well, we do what is most effective, but obviously then it's the second claim, which is efficacy is both impact and likelihood. We're claiming that their impact is potentially massive and their likelihood is nothing. So by definition, their principle falls. But secondly, we tell you on principle that you ought to prioritise what affects you the most and your own interests. The reason we give you an intuition pump as to why this principle doesn't stand is not because it's unreasonable to say everyone does everything. We do not impose that moral duty on anyone else. Speaker, this side of the House is arbitrarily promoting and posing a moral duty on women as opposed to anyone else in a way that harms the women they actually want to have. They're not getting the change they want. They cannot be at this. That is why we are unbelievably proud to oppose.
Second negative tells us that the feminist movement is not a monolithic state. That is true. Intersectional feminist voices exist. Intersectional feminist groups exist. When we give them more airtime, when we give them more attention and more of a platform and more space for them to enter that discussion, that is when we get the kind of change that the negative team conceded was probably desirable in some sense. We were not fiating that in. We were giving you structural reasons why that is only likely to occur when we broaden the platform and broaden the space and the airtime in which those voices can finally enter. A few things in this speech. Firstly, on the principal obligation. So, we give you a few reasons why we do kind of, I know people have said this is stupid, but I'm still going to talk about it. So, we tell you firstly that this is consistent with the aims of the feminist movement for a bunch of reasons, including established preference towards things like inclusivity and intersectionality, even at the cost of things like white women's issues. Also that often the axes of oppression that harm women in developing countries directly benefit privileged Western women, for instance, economically. Also because of things like the lottery of birth, that women living in developed countries haven't necessarily earned that right to live and operate in that country. And also that it is the broader responsibility of advocates and activists as recognised to give their voices to those who have less of it, or if there are people who have way less of a voice and that hole is unlikely to be filled by other people to go in and fill that. Note, this does not mean that, as the negative have ungenerously characterised, that we are propping that women in developed countries have to make themselves destitute or completely dismiss the issues of the women around them, but it does mean that they should prioritise proportionally based on all of this analysis, that they should recognise that there is a principled obligation to at least prioritise, if not to totally focus on these kinds of issues. They then tell us, well, you should be able to prioritise yourself, especially because the domestic movement's pool of capital and resources are sourced from the domestic population. Obviously, that analysis does not stand because by that analysis, if wealthy women donate the most to feminist causes, then they should also deserve the benefits of the feminist movement the most, which we recognise not to be true. But also, I would note that this still meets the wherever this movement may be, it still meets the goals of the feminist movement in that the point is to give out feminist causes broadly, and this still fills that. Okay. Secondly then, so we think there is some level of principal obligation to do this, but what does this then look like if we were to do it? They tell us a few things. They say, firstly, women who are more knowledgeable about these issues are unlikely to be the ones at the forefront, like Muslim women are not going to be the ones who are debating about issues with, about those issues. We tell you that the only way that we get those issues at the forefront, and we tell you it is also likely that we will at least have some of those voices at the forefront by prioritising these issues. That is, firstly, those women now get asked, because now instead of a 10-minute slot, if you have a 2-hour slot, you are likelier to ask a Muslim woman to fill that time. Secondly, that those women also feel like they are able to step up, because they note that issues that were dear to them that they previously did not get to speak about are now getting actively prioritised. That obviously then empowers you to step up and speak about those things. But also, there is now a feedback loop. That is, if we prioritise these issues, we are constantly getting feedback from places like where we are doing things like these policies, from places where we are donating. We are constantly now getting critiques and feedback on that we are able to respond to. They then also say, well, it is likely to be racist and rely on things like tropes. Again, we tell you the reason why that happens now is because we have things like limited airtime to prop those issues. So the only thing that gets out is a one-liner. The only thing that gets out is a sentence or a stereotype. If we now are more generous with that time and generous with that attention and generous with things like academic works, for instance, it is likelier that through maybe some racist feminists, we will have seeping through that the voices that matter, because there is broader space for those voices to enter, and that is only going to happen when we actively prioritise those issues. They then say it empowers women to, and like people more broadly, to critique women from those countries within kind of domestic communities. We tell you what we want is to maximise discourse. That is, to the extent that racist people are likely to already critique those kinds of women, we would then want the women that respond to those critiques to have the backing of the feminist movement wholeheartedly, and for that to be a priority of the feminist movement. Because as I flagged in my intro, intersectional feminists exist when they are debating or rebutting these racist claims and tropes about their country. They should have the wholehearted backing of the feminist movement and be able to know that that is a priority of that movement and that movement stands behind them. This is not going to look the way that they've told you it does. Then, considering that, is this likely to be effective and desirable? We gave you a bunch of mechanisms at Stu why this was likely to be particularly effective. We tell you firstly, there are tangible things we can do, like infrastructure, that is actually simple to create often, but simply like there is not enough resources in those countries to do that. We also tell you that many women in those countries or communities often do not have conceptions, or sometimes don't have conceptions of the feminist movement, or are unclear how they can actively help the feminist movement in their countries, and this pushes back on narratives of Western feminism that kind of perpetuate that. We also tell you it is easy to justify this kind of aid to the government for things like grants, and we also say that we build up feminist organisations also in those countries by doing things like donating. They say, well, note here, the likelihood of this happening, although the benefits may be good, is nothing. I think we should be comparative because often the domestic issues we are propping right now are often abstract, broad, generational change things that require things like changing your perception of body image and things like that. Those things often don't have immediate benefits, but we also kind of prioritize attention on that. The reason is because we know that this matters and therefore should care about it. Similarly, we should also care about this. I also think the likelihood of achieving things like concrete infrastructure is actually arguably higher than doing things like changing people's conception of female sexuality. But also they say people won't donate or people won't buy into these kinds of causes anyway. We think, okay, like women who care only about domestic issues will, probably only keep donating to proximate issues, but this now means that at least some more women donate to international issues, and that is still a benefit. But we also tell you at will that we engage broader types of women into the movement, so if we lose a couple, which we think is unlikely because we still care about proximate domestic issues, we also gain a swaths of women who previously felt alienated by the feminist movement, and they are likely to support these kinds of causes. They also tell us that we are, like, the kinds of interventions we do are unaccountable and gave us no real mechanisms as to why that would be true. We think they often are. And then they also say, well, Saudi Arabia won't accept your Western money and your Western causes. If Saudi Arabia doesn't accept it, if the worst forms of that oppression, kind of don't immediately accept it, we can then obviously give it to a different country or somebody who does currently accept it. But also note, we aren't always giving it to the governments who are most likely to push back. We are giving it to things like local feminist organizations that already want to do things like building centers where things like contraception are easily accessible, but simply don't have the funds. They then tell us, well, it'll still be rejected as Western intervention even by those communities because they themselves have bought into those narratives. We say, firstly, firstly, they are often at a micro level, and so if we are doing things like funding, that is less likely to be rejected. But secondly, I think that the kinds of ways that we intervene is not a good word, the kinds of ways that we help or give aid are likely to be more nuanced due to the analysis that I gave about how women of colour, for instance, their voices are likely to be prioritised now at least more. And because these causes are more personal and proximate, for instance, women may not like Western intervention, but they likely care about having things like abortion clinics or care about things like their daughters getting scholarships to go to school, are likely to still broadly kind of support it for the same reason that they tell us women in Western countries support domestic proximate issues. They then say there are already movements in those countries, so why do we have to do anything? Firstly, obviously, we can do things like donate and prop those movements up. We want to help those movements. But secondly, I think the governments in oppressive countries are likelier to support those local movements when they see international aid and money coming in and trying to think like maybe even if they perceive it as Western countries trying to do it their own way, they're at least marginally likelier to then respond to the demands of local organisations because they would prefer between the two maybe to support the local kind of feminist organisation rather than the Western one. So this is going to be effective and the consequences of that are desirable. Quickly on domestic issues and impacts. I just want to note here that in Western countries, we have already set up self-sustaining systems that are going to continue to self-sustain whether or not the loudest voices in those countries are propping them. What we are trying to do is set up similar self-sustaining or aid similar self-sustaining systems within the countries that currently do not have that. That means that this is something worth doing. This is going to look exactly the way that we tell you it will, and that is good. We want this debate.
Well, the best claim of the affirmative team is that this discussion will happen in a good way because it will promote more interaction between people from developed and developing countries, and it will open up more voices for people like Muslim women to talk about what feminism means to them. We know empirically that the way that white feminists talk about these issues never ends up in that discussion. We know that in France, feminists led the charge for banning the burqa. We know that white feminists' purported solutions for problems of poverty are not changing sweatshop conditions, are not changing regulations, but are fucking totally unaccountable microfinance solutions that neoliberally end up with those people saddled with death for the rest of their lives. But let us explain why structurally that discussion is never likely to happen in that way. Because the way that the second speaker put it is, I think, the more implausible version of it. They say, you go overseas and you see how it happens. Like, you go on this fun Kentucky tour and you look around and you're like, oh my god, they totally like wearing the hijab, as if just going overseas is enough to cure racism, which it is not. The more plausible version of it comes from Emily, where she says, well, you talk around the issues more and that means that you're more likely to lead to some kind of consensus. The problem with that is what we have told you throughout our case, which is that the vast majority of feminists in the developed world are white, have no experience with these issues, have neoliberal economic and political ideas, and have deeply different Western values. For example, The affirmative team has consistently said how it's so important that we build abortion clinics in Muslim countries. The vast majority of Muslim feminists in India think abortion is immoral. They oppose abortion. That is an example about how even the wokest group of people that you could possibly assemble in the Western world still have values that deeply contradict the types of values that feminists in these countries would like their countries to operate by. So that is why it is just not true that this type of discussion can happen, because the ideas that are contra to the ideas of Islamic feminism or Hindu feminism are ingrained in Western feminism. And it would be better that Western feminists kept their dirty hands off of that. But also, it is also just underestimates how deeply colonialism runs in the blood of people who come from developed countries. It's just overwhelmingly implausible that white feminists who think that come into the discussion believing that these Muslim women have internalized racism, that they wear the hijab because deep down they just want to submit to their husbands, are going to come out of that conversation thinking, oh man, I actually trust that person from a country and a race that I have been raised my entire life, and everybody in my family has been raised for generations to think are subhuman. I do not think the discussion would operate in that way. If you believe this claim, you believe that the negative quite convincingly wins this debate. Because even if they prove that West developed feminists are likely to be able to successfully get change, those changes will be negative. They will be not what the women in those countries want, not what the feminists in those countries want, and therefore we have won this debate already. Secondly, let us assume that their activists their intentions will kind of correlate with the interests of women in these countries. Here's why we still win the debate. Firstly, in terms of the way that they phrase it, they're like, you've got to get the most significant marginal benefit. We have conclusively proven to you that there is almost no marginal benefit. The governments in these countries will resist you. They do not want a precedent of other countries influencing your social fabric by donating money to organizations. The feminists in these countries will often oppose you because they will think that you're delegitimizing them, that you are tainting their image in that country with your Western money, and everyone hates you. Thirdly, as we told you, to literally no response, people will not donate in very large numbers. Because now, if the vast majority of feminism is just talking about how important women that you've never met are, in countries that you've never been to are, that would be like telling Black Americans that they should care overwhelmingly about Africans in Africa or in the countries they came from, rather than the very significant issues that they suffer from in their daily lives. That is not a persuasive message. That is something that shrinks the pie until the margin is nothing for their team. Fourthly, it is totally unaccountable, as we explained, to no response. Because you just give money to a charity, it is extremely difficult to measure the overall efficacy over charity over time, because the governments don't collect data, the media doesn't really report on it, it's very easy for those charities to be dishonest about it, at which point you have no idea if any of the things that you're doing actually have any benefit. As opposed to you knowing that you campaigning for people to fund more domestic violence shelters in your country means you get more voters for those direct policies. So, contrast that with our very significant marginal benefits. Their responses here are like, but it's over, guys. Now we're just fighting for wishy-washy things. As if the 1/3 of women who experience sexual violence don't need more funding from the feminist movement for their lawyers. As if we're not chronically underfunded in terms of domestic violence shelters, even in Australia, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Their rhetoric here was exactly what we said people would perceive this move to be. The issues here are over, guys. Why do you still care about the wage gap or about rate? Over there, they're really suffering. That is what the narrative that they empower, that is the narrative that they say as an argument, and that is the very significant marginal benefit that we get for concrete things that can still change and that will change in the future. By their own metric, I have won the second time. Thirdly, here is how, even if they're well-intentioned, and even if they do have a significant impact, they still lose this debate. Because, as we told you, the most significant problem that developing worlds suffer from in terms of feminism is not a lack of funding, it is a lack of buy-in. No women want to join the feminist movement, and the feminist movement has to convince them that it is still, something that can be reconciled with their culture and their religion and their nationhood. Whereas, when you have an enormous group of, random white wealthy people sending hordes of money to your country, that is exactly what taints all of those organizations with the brush of the West, with colonialism, and therefore makes it so much more difficult to persuade any woman in the developing world that feminism is a legitimate thing that they should opt into. So even if they're well-intentioned and successful, they still lose the most significant fight. And finally, finally, white harms the developed worlds, during which I will attempt to win this debate again, which is that we told you, and it's kind of obvious that this harms women in the developed world. You're reprioritizing resources, people are less likely to buy into feminism as a whole because now it doesn't speak to their particular experiences, and so on. But here's why we are actually totally principally legitimate in prioritizing those issues above the issues of women in other countries. And that is because you have the right to prioritize your own. That is why countries have an obligation to their own citizens more than they do to other people, because those people in their country pay tax, just like people in the feminist movement in developed countries contribute directly to the feminist movement. And I think the measuring of suffering that the whole affirmative team's case is contingent on in terms of prioritization is just immoral. They're like, imagine saying that to a victim of domestic violence or rape in the developed world, like just being like, look, sorry guys, like I wish I could have given you money for your domestic crisis center, but I'm afraid that your suffering just isn't quite as important, not quite as intersectional. That is not a message that feminism can send to those people. That is not a moral way to make decisions. The moral way to make decisions is to say, we will give back to those who are our own. That is a fine thing for feminism to do. That is why we have quite conclusively won this debate.
In the Western world donated under the metric that they supplied as the only mechanism to achieve any of the tangible impacts that they wanted, the magnitude of that benefit was incredibly tiny. That was because foreign aid didn't work. That was because donations were corrupt. And that was because there weren't many feminists in the Western world to begin with, and this policy would inherently far reduce the buy-in that people could have to get into the feminist movement. That was to say, when we brought you all of our benefits on prioritizing domestic issues and ensuring that those issues and outcomes are actually tangible, and all of the harms of associating this change with interventionism at the very best, if they even got that change, the benefits that they provided in terms of a nebulous form of infrastructure and discourse simply wasn't enough to win them this debate. 3 questions. Firstly, just quickly on principle, they wanted to tell you that feminists feminists need to prioritize the most disadvantaged source. We told you down the bench that feminists do not have a moral obligation in order to prioritize people worse off than them. That necessarily and inherently means that those women in developing countries need to prioritize those who are even more disadvantaged and even more disadvantageous positions. That was incredibly harmful because it was extremely telling when they said that if Saudi Arabia refused our aid, we would just give that to another country, because that essentially acknowledged our mechanism that it was really important that feminists concentrated the limited capital that they did have into the most effective ways to exercise that capital and transfer that into consequential and tangible outcomes. So which groups did we support? Because originally out of first we heard this stuff about Oprah and this sort of a very nebulous discursive material, but then we got more diverse parts of the feminist movement when the opposition wanted to stand by intersectional feminists. We thought that the fundamental problems with this, and we told you this all down the bench, was that a lot of these minority women were firstly unlikely to be leaders of this movement in the Western world, because mainstream feminism was largely led by Western feminists many who did subscribe to many neoliberal ideas, and especially, as we told you, were the ones who were more likely to be spearheading the types of ideas and the types of movements that would suggest that these women in developing countries needed that intervention in the first place. But even still, it meant that even these women were unlikely to be able to understand and impact those issues on the ground in a way that was quantifiable. So even if those feminists in those countries had some of the same interests as people in the West, there was an extremely marginal benefit here, and it was exacerbated by all the harms that we told you down the bench that when powerful countries and powerful developing countries can synonymize feminism with Western intervention, that is an incredibly harmful way to structurally undermine any nascent systems of feminism that have emerged within those developing countries. That was ultimately to say that thirdly, we got efficacy on every ground in terms of concentrated domestic priorities and in terms of organic change in a way that they did not. Because what did they say? They tried to claim more concrete changes, they tried to claim more concrete discourse. But what did we tell you? We told you firstly that these issues were incredibly structural. So you don't fix the issue of abortion by just building infrastructure and abortion clinics when the problem within these developing countries is that violence and backlash will be leveled against those people in those clinics, will be leveled against them in a systematic and normative way. Because this was incredibly normative. Stu said that it was harder to change Western norms. If that is true, why is it easier to change norms within these developing countries? Because we told you that surely these norms are harder to buy into. Surely there is a lack of buy-in. Surely their harms are more long-term if feminism in these developing countries is harmed forever. That is to say that this did not only mean that the parties of change, such as lawmakers, were less likely to listen to feminism, but feminism's legitimacy decreased in a multiplicative way when feminism was never able to prove that it had any quantifiable outcomes, never any way to prove that they were systematically changing or normatively changing the way in which gender was perceived in this world. That was to say that their funding and donations metric simply didn't work when it meant that this funding would decrease and that the government, which had the ability to allocate this funding best, was least likely to be able to level it, especially when these organizations had conflicting ideals. So, even if they were marginally successful, we told you all the harms of intervention. We brought to you that it was oppositional to the way in which feminists in developing countries campaign, and also there was a multiplicative decrease of funding over time, there was a multiplicative decrease of legitimacy over time. So if the difference under their side is a small organization building some infrastructure, we proved that firstly, anything that they did get would be harmful, but secondly, that you were never likely to get this in the first place. At the end of this debate, we proved that all of the harms to feminism in the developing world were long-lasting and lasted in perpetuity to marginal benefits on their side. We won this debate.
Not all feminists have a lived experience of every axis of intersectional oppression, but the best feminists are the ones who give voices to women who do experience those axes of oppression. The problem for this team is that they conflate the words feminists in developed countries with white feminists in Western countries, ignoring that Western feminists also includes Muslim women who can advocate for the interests of Muslim women in developing countries. That it's not just the United States being an imperialist dick, it's also countries like South Korea. They said that people would rely on tropes, but it's not, because you get Yasmin Abdul-Majid to speak to Muslim issues in developing countries, you don't get Western white feminists to speak to that. First question is on efficacy. We gave you two mechanisms. Firstly, in terms of discourse and advocacy. Secondly, in terms of financial and human capital. Their reductive response is that feminist is not a monolithic state. Yes, neither is the Gates Foundation. I think they've done pretty well as well. Importantly, you don't need to have a full-on invasion to make change in developing countries, because we were never proposing that anyway. And you know, the comparative imperative that we give you is that feminist organizations are non-existing or emerging in developing countries. They say they exist in countries like India. Well, sure, we wouldn't create new feminist organizations in those countries, we would just give them the funding. Secondly, rights are infringed more in developing countries, for example, property laws and other access in terms of factual access to discrimination or anti-discrimination, importantly. But importantly here, they have three pushes. Their first push is that this will be perceived as Western imperialism, but they never impacted the marginal impact or harm of this under the status quo. We already told you, first of all, this is already perceived as white feminism as opposed to just feminism, and secondly, that men in developing countries perceive feminists as zero-sum, and that is a fragility which we tackle. And as Will tells you to no response, we can help men in those countries as well. They got no further engagement under their side of the house. Secondly, they say that Saudi Arabia will crack down on feminist organizations, but we told you a third. Even if the money does not go to women in the worst countries, it goes to women in countries where the situations and lived experiences are comparatively more harmful than the lived experiences of women in developed countries under the status quo. Nate Reply frames this as a concession. It's obviously not a concession, because we can still win the debate if we can't get into Saudi Arabia, but we get into a country where women are still oppressed more than they are in the United States. Their final push here was trivial. That is to say that there will be a sort of kind of pseudo-moralizing effect where you think that your obligation is discharged. That sounds to me like an argument to never do the most important thing first in any event, which to me sounds a bit silly, because if you can get a tangible gain on the ground, as we said to you clearly from first, that's something that you ought to prioritise. Secondly, on the obligation, we told you there were three reasons. Firstly, this was consistent with the aims of an intersectional feminist movement. Secondly, that economic access of oppression and comparative lack of lottery in birth means there is an obligation to care for those who do not have those opportunities. And thirdly, that this is broadly the responsibility of activists anyway. 3 pushes. Firstly, you have the right to prioritise those around you, which reveals the arbitrariness until the only explanation we get is a third negative of tax. But obviously this is not a mechanism of taxation, it's a mechanism of individual private donations. Very, very different. Secondly, they said a right to prioritise yourself, but obviously it is a spectrum. That's why Liliana's example is a straw man in this debate, because we wouldn't have the obligation that you make yourself destitute to benefit women in other countries, but to the extent that you have large amounts of disposable income and capital, you should prioritise women in developed countries to your exclusion. Finally, they have a weird intuition bash, that privileged men don't have a responsibility to help less privileged men. Obviously they do, and the response that we'll give you is that by that logic, they don't have a responsibility to help feminists in any event, and they've got no response as well. Finally, they say you care about those who are your own. The question in this debate is, what is your own? Is it people who live within the same arbitrarily defined borders as you, or is it women in other countries as well? Finally, on domestic issues, they strawman our case here. We were never propping exclusive assistance, but prioritising assistance. So you still care about issues in domestic countries, but now we say that feminists should also care about interests and issues in other countries as well. And secondly, the negative team assumes that highlighting these issues, for example, abortion in developing countries, does not also shine a light on it in developed countries as well. These things were not structurally mutually exclusive. Finally, they talked about right-wing neocons here as if all people in government are men and that all men in politics are anti-feminist. But that was not true. Importantly, we gave materials to why feminism in the West developing countries was sustainable already. There were stronger democratic and progressive incentives, and the Western feminists with specific interests will still pursue those causes. That was never responded to, and engaged with these probably the only push that this team has left in this area of the debate, but because we had that from first, we got no response, we win, that's why we won.